Hi, welcome to the Princeton Review Live. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Blaise Moritz, and I am the Vice President of Products at the Princeton Review. And so I get to work with hundreds of great teachers and tutors and thousands of students all across the country and all around the world every year. And so glad that you could join us this afternoon to talk a bit about subject-verb agreement. But if you're tuning in hoping for subject-verb agreement, I've got a bit of a bonus for you. I've been doing this for a long time. I started teaching with the Princeton Review back in 1994. And while I am broadcasting to you live today from Toronto, Canada, I back then was in Chicago. Michael Jordan had just won the third Bulls NBA championship. It was that long ago. Bill Clinton was the president of the United States. Uh, and so along the way, what has always been so exciting about being part of the Princeton Review is that whatever we are talking about, whether it's subject-verb agreement or any other concept that gets tested on the SAT, the ACT, or any number of other tests, we're always talking about putting you in control of your education, empowering you, making you feel like you've got the skills and the confidence to, sort of go forward and conquer any challenge, manage stress and anxiety that can often come as you sort of journey through education. And so I think you're going to get a little bit more than just subject verb agreement out of this. Let's start here. Who said that? Grammar is a piano I play by ear, since I seem to have been out of school the year the rules were mentioned. All I know about grammar is its infinite power. Yes, later, if you tell somebody, what did you do on that live stream? Did you learn anything? You can say, well, it wasn't really so much about learning something. It was more about acquiring infinite power. If you think you know who is if you know who is say that, you could put that in the chat. We have a moderator who'll be looking at your questions and flowing those over to me periodically, and I'll sort of address those a little bit in the flow of as we go through what we're talking about today, and especially look at those, a couple of points in the lesson, especially towards the end. So think about, you can even like copy that down and perhaps try to Google it or something and see. There's a visual cue there. I drew that portrait myself earlier today. So I think there's a lot of truth, though, in this, right? I think that a lot of us feel like we play grammar by ear. And then sometimes we feel like that's good, and sometimes we feel like that's bad. And I think a lot of us feel like, boy, the rules, like maybe if I learn a language in a structured way in a school setting, whatever language that may be, maybe it's English, but oftentimes it might be Spanish or French or Latin or Mandarin or something, right? Well, then I feel like I get drilled in terminology and tables and things which make me feel like I've got this grounding. And then sometimes it seems to me like when I'm working in English and English class, or I take tests that have English sections or verbal sections or writing sections or grammar sections or whatever they want to call them, then I don't feel really like I have infinite power. Um, so, and there was one interesting comment so far. Karen asked us, is subject verb agreement just if the subject is singular, the verb has to be singular with a few exceptions? In a way, yes, but in a way, no. I mean, subject verb agreement, oftentimes you'll hear it explained that way, right? You can watch any number of videos that sort of say, subject verb agreement means that there must be agreement. There must be a singular noun with a singular verb. There must be a plural noun with a plural verb. So, while that is true, and we are looking to simplify it, not complexify it, we're also looking today at a sort of a different approach. And one of the best teachers I ever had, one of the teachers who made me feel the most like I had infinite power, um, was my calculus teacher. And the calculus teacher told us on day one that if we took everything step by step by step, that we would never have any trouble with calculus. I was skeptical. I wanted to take calculus at least once in my life, but I wasn't sure how far I would go with it. And of course, it's a subject that you hear that is one of the scarier subjects you might take. And I felt very empowered that that was true. That by following on step by step by step, I felt very clear all the way. So while it is true that subject verb agreement does mean singular subject with singular verb, plural subject with plural verb, one of the things that's interesting is that that bit of knowledge, A, doesn't necessarily mean that much to everybody. Like, what does that actually mean? Like, what are the inner workings of that? Because what it turns out later on is that without some of that knowledge of the inner workings, you don't necessarily have that power. And when you don't have that power, later on, you hit a brick wall. You're writing an essay, you're doing a writing based question on the SAT or ACT or something, and you're struggling. You're missing things that actually, at their core, get right down to that very simple kernel of truth about singular with singular, plural with plural. And Ray, that is indeed Joe Didion. Good work there. All right, so what are we doing in this session? We're going to do a few things today. First of all, who's this session for? We've gone into that a little bit, but we'll just run over that. Why do we care about subject-verb agreement? Just preview that a little bit, but we're going to delve into that. What it is. So again, part of this is making sure you feel empowered by having a very specific understanding that starts at one level and goes up and up and up, so that every step of the way you feel like you know it, you can explain what it is, how it's changed in this new scenario, right? One of the things that we always think about at the Princeton Review is this. Standardized tests are interesting in two very important ways. Number one, when I'm in a regular class, I may or may not know as much of the teacher like later in life. Like maybe I know more than the teacher when I start the class. Maybe I don't. Maybe, I still have to take grade 11 math with or junior year math with a math teacher who maybe I feel like I actually am a little bit sharper with the math, or maybe my grade 11 math teacher is such a genius that I feel like I'll never know as much math as them. And to some extent, becoming a math teacher or whatever is not necessarily the point. But when we talk about these kinds of skills, it is very much the point today for you to know this just as well as I do. And there's no reason why you can't, right? And then the other thing that's very powerful about that is that core to taking a standardized test is that it's a performance situation. You take things that you practice and that you're familiar with, but then you go to a new situation. You see a version of those questions, a version of how they're tested, which is different than what you've necessarily seen before in practice. So core is having an understanding which allows you the flexibility, right? You need to be able to know this in a way where you can apply that and get that question right and not feel sort of stuck in just the understanding or just the context that you specifically saw in practice. Okay? So where do we use our infinite subject verb agreement power? When does subject verb agreement get tricky, even for ones as powerful as we are? So where does it get a little bit more complicated? And how can we use our power for good and or for answering ACT and SAT test questions, which may or may not be the same thing? So yes, who, why, what, where, when, and how is what we're going to go through today. Now, I will put in one little footnote. One thing we're not going to do a lot of today is we're not going to do a lot of test questions. Today isn't so much about hey, everybody, put D in the chat if you think it's D, and you all can see on the question and read it and see that it's D, or some people see it's B. Again, incredibly important to practice. Today, we're really taking a very focused, almost sort of a step back and making sure we really drill in and have a very solid understanding of this concept. So who is this session for? Right? Well, those seeking mastery, right? Again, you want to know this just as well as I do, just as well as any expert does. So if you feel like just like Joan Didion said, you seem to have been out of school the year the rules were mentioned. And I think a lot of people do feel that way with grammar, almost at any age. And, you're pretty good at this stuff, except when you're not, right? Sometimes it sounds right and it is, and then, you hit a wall, or you get something wrong, and you're not quite sure why, right? So we're talking about developing mastery in those areas. When we talk about grammar as infinite power, we're really talking about trying to break out of this mindset, right? There's a tendency to think math is objective, English, verbal, whatever you want to call it, is subjective, right? And that colors our thinking over and over again. We think math, there's an answer. English, there really isn't an answer. You could argue it different ways. Math, there are clear steps. English, even the best teachers struggle to tell you, like, step by step by step how to do it. I did everything that the teacher told me, last time, about how to make my essay better, or how to answer those reading comprehension questions, or even those grammar questions. And still, I'm doing everything that they've said, but I'm still not getting the results. Oh, it's so much better in math. Like, if they tell me there are 5 steps, there are 5 steps, and I get a point for each one of them, and I go through them. If only, sort of everything could be, like math that way, right? So that's a mindset we really want to break. And we want to break it in 2 important ways. And again, this gets back to my theme of how at Princeton Review, we are talking about tests, but we're also talking about things that we can build for the future and that you can use throughout your life. So on tests, English is not subjective, right? English is made objective by the structure and the nature of those tests, right? When you look at an English question, or verbal, or writing, or whatever it's called, at any given moment on the ACT or the SAT or PSAT, those questions are written to be objective. There is a credited response, and there are, people who are basically scientists of tests, engineers of tests, creating the basis, the foundation of that objectivity. That's something you can learn. You can learn how they're putting that together, and you can learn the concepts it's built on. But then also, right, I think even in our day-to-day lives, right, we need to say that, English is kind of a broad word. We talk a lot in math about, oh, there's algebra 1 and algebra 2, and there's geometry, and there's pre-calc and calc and trigonometry, and there's functions, and wow, like, and if you go into university, you could do non-Euclidean geometry, right? Sometimes we don't like that. Vocabulary speaks to an awareness of the diversity of math, and the diversity of math even includes places where math gets subjective, right? A lot of times we don't talk about the diversity of English. Especially, we don't talk about the idea that communication is a skill, right? It is a tool. And when we talk about the kind of English stuff that is tested on standardized tests, we're talking about that kind of communication as a tool, right? The way math is a tool that can send rocket ships to outer space or make skyscrapers stand up, right? English can be, or any language, right, can be a tool of communication to inform people, effectively, to persuade them. And so in this realm, English or language, right, has an objective nature, right? So we want to get out of this way of thinking about it, right? And think more clearly that, okay, let's look for the objective part of English. And that's really where you start to see grammar. Now, you can see it in aspects of writing also, which again is informed by grammar and other aspects of style. You can see it in reading, right? So there's objectivity to be found in English, and there's power to be found there. Grammar is often sort of a nice gateway to that concept, because grammar maybe is the little hook, right? The place where you most clearly see, oh yeah, I get it. They're kind of rules and stuff, right? Now, today's not going to be all about rules. We're going to use actually math to help us out for a second. And we're going to use the rubric of a test, to help us out for a second. So a lot of times when we take a test, we say to ourselves, oh, that question was easy, or that question was difficult. And then people debate, what did you think of the last question, the bonus question? Oh, I thought that one was kind of easy for a bonus question. Really? I thought that was super difficult. Why are we all over the place this way? Right? I mean, sometimes it can be the fact that your high school teacher isn't necessarily a psychometrician or a test engineer. When they make your midterm or your quiz, they're not necessarily basing it on, tens of thousands of students taking the test at once versus other students taking the exact same test with analysis and curves and everything, right? They're just making a quiz that they think is fair. And sometimes it turns out to be fair, sometimes it doesn't. But let's try to break down what maybe makes an easy question from the point of view of somebody writing a test question, and what's probably going on in your mind, whether you're aware of it or not. So here's a math question, right? What is the area of a circle, right? And this isn't about, having any judgment or anything. So if you're looking at this thinking, I haven't learned the area of a circle yet, I thought it would be fun to tune in here, and I'm, of whatever age, whatever program, I have no idea how to find the area of the circle. But probably a lot of you tuning in today, thinking about high school level subjects, thinking about the SAT, ACT, feel like, oh, well, the only thing I missed in here are some numbers, right? Uh, you know, I've got some keywords here, right? I see the word area. Okay, cool. So I know I already have a formula in my mind, because then I see area and circle. Well, clearly, look, even this little yellow line here, that's the radius, and that's all I need, right? Clearly, that's area equals pi r squared. Give me a number. I'll plug it into my calculator. Away we go, right? So that feels like an easy question, right? Why is it easy, right? Couple of things to notice. Very clear where to begin, right? Like, I understand the terms, they give me a starting point. I can kind of see the end of the solution right away from the beginning, right? Almost before I go through a couple of steps, before I had a number, I would plug it into R, and I would, punch it into my calculator, right? R square, and, multiply by pi, and then I'd have the answer, right? So in a sense, there's a couple of steps, but the journey is so short that I can pretty much see the end from the beginning. In fact, it's such a sort of a pleasant feeling, right? I sort of see what I'm being asked, how to do it, and the steps, and that I can get to the end all at once. That's a very comfortable feeling, right? So what's a difficult question? Well, this is a very, you know, modified, abstracted version kind of a typical sort of SAT or ACT medium or difficult question, right? You've probably seen this on the SAT or ACT tests you may have looked at, or PSAT, or even other math you've done in school, or in the figure, the area of, and it goes on to tell you very carefully that, the circle is inscribed within the square, and blah, 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 blah. And then finally they say, what is the area of the shaded region? Now, again, the point here isn't whether or not you find this kind of question personally easy or personally difficult. Maybe you've done a million questions like this and it's easy. Maybe you've had a grounding in math where you have a problem solving ability, where you look at this and you think, oh, I get it. I get the concept they're testing. But many students would look at this, regardless of whether they have a good grounding in math or feel generally confident or in math or not, and struggle to know some of the things we were talking about on the last question. The last question was easy to know where to begin. Some people might look at this and say, well, boy, it's kind of hard to know where to begin. I mean, some people would even not necessarily not formulate the idea like, oh, right, I guess I could get the area of the square and subtract out the area of the circle. But wait a minute, how do I get the area of the circle? They didn't give me the radius. Usually I have the radius. Now, of course, I'm not trying to say that you can't go down a path here, right? Obviously, there is a path, but it was harder to start, right? The radius is kind of disguised from me. It's in there, right? If they gave me the area of the square, they've given me the radius of the circle essentially. But that's a couple of jumps. And even when I make those jumps, I'm going to have to execute correctly a few more steps. So what is a difficult question? Well, in the mindset of a test writer, or even in a way that you can help, you can use to your advantage in your own thought process, an easy question isn't one you thought was easy, and a difficult question isn't one you thought was difficult. An easy question is one where you can objectively see that, oh, it was easy to know where to start. It was clear to know where to start. It was relatively clear to see at a glance that I would do certain steps to get there. Those steps are pretty familiar to me, and there are too many of them. Difficulty usually means it's purposefully more mysterious where to start, right? To some extent, what difficult questions test is, how willing are you to start? Like I often say, the uh, the practical real world application in the world of testing of that old saying, perhaps you've heard like genius is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. That sounds cool, right? Makes it sound more attainable to be a genius if that's what you want to be, right? Because it makes it sound like it's not all about inspiration, it's about hard work. But then you're left thinking, yeah, but what kind of hard work? Well, one of the kinds of hard work is being willing to start, right? If you could look at a student struggling with this and a student, doing well at it, sure, there'd be some students doing well at it who just saw it right away. But most of the students who did well on this question would be the ones who said, I actually don't see the whole path right away, but I see a circle, I see area. I'm still going to get started. I'm still going to write down a equals pi r squared, and I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to see what that unlocks. Like one of those puzzle games, right, where you do the first step and then it unlocks something, and then you start to see how the rest of the puzzle unlocks. Most of the people who struggle with something or feel it's difficult just feel like they're really stuck. I kind of want to know like how this is going to work. I'm anxious about it. I don't want to get started not knowing the whole sort of the sort of whole sort of process. So that can be a very that can be a very challenging thing, to sort of do mentally. And I think that that's one of the places where people struggle. So that's what we're trying to get over, right? We don't want this to be mysterious. So how do we make it not mysterious? Well, there's one other thing I want to throw in there for math, and then we're going to go back to seeing how this applies to our subject verb agreement. One of the big questions is, do I know or do I just sort of know? How many of the factors of 24 are prime numbers? Okay. So again, sort of a basic math question, the kind of basic concept that sometimes gets tested on the SAT and ACT or gets tested sometimes indirectly. I've got some keywords, factors. That's a thing I learned to do with numbers at some point, right? 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 times 8, 4 times 6. Okay, I think I've gone around. All right. So now what else am I being asked? I know factors. Well, I'm being asked about prime numbers. Okay, cool. Well, I know that, yeah, a lot of even numbers aren't prime numbers, like 1 times 4, 2 times 2, 12. I've just proven very, obviously that 24 isn't a prime number. It's got a ton of factors, right? So probably it's pretty easy for me to say, right? In the sense, in that, again, in that objective sense of easy, in the sense of what I'm confident about, what I see a straight path towards, pretty easy to say that these 5 numbers are out. But that leaves me with a big question, right? Is 1 a prime number? Do I know or do I sort of know? Am I absolutely confident in what the answer is here? Or am I just sort of kind of thinking, trying to like rationalize to myself, well, I think the way I would look at it is that, of course, well, that's not really where you want to be, right? Not only is it where you want to be in terms of like feeling empowered and feeling confident in the skills you have to apply in different situations. It's also not the place you want to be when the clock is ticking on a standardized test, right? You want to know, right? So if we go back and summarize, what we're going to try to do is make every question easy. Today, we're looking at how to do that with subject verb agreement. But I think this little foray into math, right, helps us crystallize 3 things, right? And I put easy in red because we don't want it to be, just the easy questions where we feel this thing. We want difficult. Let's unlock difficult, right? Easy. I've done this a lots of times, right? Whereas if I difficult, I don't really recognize this. I'm not sure where to start, right? Like, when it's easy, like I know what steps to take, right? A equals pi r squared, plug it in. Here I go, right? Difficult. I'm not really sure where to start. Right. And as we just saw, like it's easy when I feel like I'm solid on what I need to know. If somewhere along the line I picked up a solid grounding in the idea that 1 is not a prime number because a prime number has to have 2 factors. It has to have itself and 1. 1 doesn't pass that test. It only has 1 factor. So it's a sort of a funky exception, but it's an exception. If I feel like I learned that and very confident, then that question is easy. If I only sort of know this stuff, if I think I kind of remember, but I'm not sure. Maybe one is because it's one and one. So I don't know. Maybe it's a special case where it is a prime number, even though it doesn't have two factors, because it would be kind of weird if it wasn't a prime number, because aren't a lot of the small odd numbers prime? I don't know. Did that make sense to you? Right? So this is not the place where we want to be, right? We can make the difficult questions easy by taking square aim at this. How can we turn things we don't recognize into things we've done a lot? How can we turn questions where we're not sure where to start into questions where we see what steps to take, right? And how can we make sure we really know the things that we need to do? Right? Why do we care about subject verb agreement? Again, right? We're trying to go through this. Um, uh, are we going to learn about, yeah, sorry, are we going to start learning about subject agreement specifically? We definitely are. But again, right, I always want to sort of say, like, there's a lot of places where, like, I can watch any old video, I can pick up any old book. One of the things that we're trying to do, especially at Princeton Review here, is always make sure, like, you have that foundation, a launching pad into making sure, right? So again, like, why do you care? Like, okay, we can talk about it specifically, but why should we? Right? Well, because we speak and write in sentences, right? Subject verb agreement is actually the foundation of everything. The simplest complete sentence is two words, a subject and a verb. If you can get agreement there, you can get it everywhere. And that's where we actually want to go back to our notion of, where do we use the ear, right? Joan Didion said, I feel like it's a piano I play by ear. A lot of great piano players play by ear. That doesn't mean that the ear is wrong and the rules are right. And what I need to do is stop using my ears and start learning all the rules, right? I need to know how to use this tool and how to put it together with other tools. So what is subject verb agreement, to get into it more specifically? All right. So if somebody asks you, what did you learn today? Of course, you can make the joke about infinite power, but let's start with one basic building block here to make sure we're on the same page. Parts of speech. This is a classification system for words. So it is definitely true in the world of grammar that the jargon does help. We're trying to keep today sort of jargon light, but we're going to try to layer in some things so you feel like you do come away with some specific things. I can remember a point in my high school career where my honors English teacher asked the class on the first day how many parts of speech there are, and it was to my credit that I was the only person who knew. So now every one of you can know, right? So there are 8, and here they are: the noun, the verb, right? Those are the ones we're going to focus on mostly today, but we're going to see some others come into play, right? So noun, as you probably remember, a person, place, thing. Blaise, the dog, right? Toronto, where I'm broadcasting from, the city where you're watching this, or town where you're watching this. A verb, something you're doing, right? Presenting this session to you, watching this session, right? An adjective, right? Something that describes a noun. An adverb, something that describes a verb. Today, pronouns are also going to be really important, because pronouns are one of the things that start to add in the complexity. That's when you start to go from, well, isn't it just singular with singular and plural with plural, right? Pronouns are one of the things that actually start to make that difficult to see, right? So we're going to look at some pronouns and talk about how we don't get distracted by them. Prepositions are also another thing that gets distracting. So when we talk about prepositions, we're talking about little words like, I go to the store, right? This presentation was made by Blaise, right? To, by, at, in, right? These are our prepositions. Oftentimes, prepositions introduce cool bits of extra information. You know, that's neat to know that Blaise is in Toronto today. However, right, that extra information can kind of float around in different parts in the sentence. And sometimes it can float around into parts of the sentence which make it difficult to see the connection between the subject and the verb, and complicate being able to see clearly whether they agree, right? So we're definitely going to, sort of focus on the noun, the verb, the pronoun, and the preposition. But you can say that today you came away with an understanding that there are 8 parts of speech. Now, an interesting footnote. I've talked a little bit today about what makes a successful student. So make sure you're writing those things down, right? One thing that makes a successful student is getting started, right? Instead of waiting for something to happen, you get started. Another thing is this successful student is somebody who can deal with a little bit of ambiguity, right? So can you go on the web right now and see whether or not there are 8 parts of speech? You're gonna find some people saying that there are 9 parts of speech, some people saying that there are 10 parts of speech, right? And that usually gets down to people having different thoughts about the word adjective and thinking about trying to make it helpful for students. So, once upon a time in biology, right, you would have learned that there were animals and plants. And then you would have learned that there were, in fact, animals, plants, and fungi. And, within the last 20 years, we've decided there are actually some other organisms, microscopic organisms and stuff, bacteria of various kind, that actually mean that we must have like 5 or maybe even 6 potentially kingdoms of like in our classification system. So, in a classification system, it's good to sort of be able to focus in on what is it useful for. It's interesting that some people want to break out articles or even determiners out of adjectives, right? An article would be something like the in the dog. In a sense, the goes with the dog. It gives us extra specificity about the dog. So, in a sense, the is an adjective, just the way white dog or black dog, the colors of the dog are adjectives. Right? Some people disagree with that. Right. So that can be an interesting sort of thing. But to be successful, right, we can focus in and say, okay, but these things are important and these things are sort of always set there. And those 4 that we're going to focus in on noun, verb, pronoun, preposition are essential to our understanding of the verb. So let's talk about how to use our ears, because we've said that, like, not necessarily a bad thing to use your ears. So we said that the simplest complete sentence could be as short as 2 words. Is this one? We've got Blaise runs, right? So let's look at our parts of speech. We've got that part of speech is a noun, Blaise, person, runs, verb, it's an action I take, right? So cool. We've got a noun and a verb, right? The roles they play in the sentence. We've got a subject, right? And then we've got a verb, right? So we've got a complete sentence here. Yes. Excellent. All right. So that's something you can hear with your ears, right? So that's not necessarily something where, because in French class or whatever, they would say, je cours, il court, elle court, right? Nous courons, vous courez, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that, oh my goodness, I got a grammar question wrong, or I did something grammatically incorrect in my essay. I must have to memorize the English equivalent of verb tables and stuff. I'm not saying you can't, but don't just throw out your ears because somehow you get the idea that ears lead you astray, but rules will never let you down, right? You can use your ears, right? You can use your ears to get started if you know how to use them. You can use them to test those simple cases. And that may seem like, okay, so what? That's not hard. I mean, yeah, sure, I guess. But remember what I said about the calculus teacher. That's that first step. If you can do that, and you can do the next one we're going to do, then everything else is just building on that and going up. Right? So let's hear the agreement, right? Blaise runs, Blaise run, right? I can hear that Blaise run is wrong, right? I don't need to necessarily define the word agreement. I don't have to use the word conjugating a verb. I don't have to talk about even the concept of singular or plural yet, right? I can hear that Blaise runs agrees, right? Same thing with Blaise and Bruno runs. No, Blaise and Bruno run, right? So again, don't not trust your ears just because every once in a while they let you down, right? Your ears can let you down a lot in certain places, right? They can let you down with idioms, right? Oh, what prepositions come in what phrases, and sometimes those rules are very arbitrary, and no amount of hearing, unless it's hearing in the sense of lots of good experience or lots of good reading, is necessarily going to build that ear. But we can hear this, right? And again, now not everyone can. Maybe you're at a point in your English where you're learning that, and that's fine. Then you can really focus in on that. But no, if you can hear that, you should trust that, because that is the starting place. That is the building block, right? So when people say agreement in number, that's all it means, right? We said, okay, so Blaise is one person, singular, and there's our singular verb, right? Again, I don't need to memorize a table or anything. I can hear that that's a match, right? Just like I can hear Blaise plus my friend Bruno, two persons, that's plural. I've got my plural verb. Now, again, if you're sitting there thinking, yeah, 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 when are we getting to the good stuff? Like, I know all of this, right? But again, if you know this, but then you're struggling in other places, or you don't always get everything right here, right? Again, this is the foundation, right? So, where do we use subject verb agreement? It's all around us, right? Subject verb agreement is everywhere. Everything you say, everything you write, right? Everything you write for school, grammar based questions on the SAT and ACT, right? But let's be careful. Sometimes it can feel like, oh, okay, well, if it's everywhere, then it's sort of nowhere, right? Then it's just all around us and it's not very specific and it's not very useful. No, everywhere is not nowhere, right? So you have to look for subject verb act agreement actively. Look for it in every sentence. Again, how do we get started? How do we switch on, right? You have to have a discipline and an ethic where I say, I know this basic foundational idea. I know that every sentence has a subject and a verb. I know that they agree, and I am looking for that. I'm not waiting for it to pop out at me. I'm not waiting to see, oh, that one looks wrong, or oh, right. Every single time I see a subject and a verb, I am checking that, right? Now, think about what it means when it's missing, right? Now, again, this is where we can also, again, build a framework where we're able to be very focused on what skills and what ideas belong where. When a subject or verb is missing, there's a couple of possibilities. It could be just a mistake. If it's on a test, it's a mistake. It's something you're being asked to spot. Now, interestingly enough, there's other places where it might be missing where it's intentional, right? So that's where you can get into subjective English, right? Like you're looking at a rap, you're looking at a poem, you're listening to a recording of somebody talking, you're watching a movie, right? They may not have subject and verb in every sentence. They may not have subject verb agreement, right? So when it's missing there you get into aspects of style and experience and evolution of language. Exciting, interesting, like calculus, like pre-calculus, like, getting into non-Euclidean geometry. But there's also an objective side where, if it's missing, it's a mistake in certain contexts. And you also then have to ask yourself, and this is where you really need to challenge yourself, is it really missing or is it just hiding? Right? Like think about some analogies that can also help you. Think about music. There's a beat. Well, when the beat drops, is it missing or is it just hidden for a minute? Right? You still kind of feel it and you still wait for when the beat comes back. Or maybe you like architecture, right? A building that can be very fancy and ornate and a building that is very simple and traditional oftentimes are essentially the same box. It's a matter of how much, ornamentation and decoration they've put around that box. A lot of times sentences are like that. So if we feel like we can see the solid structure of the subject and the verb, we can look for that in those other contexts. And we can see when it's not missing. In fact, they're just trying to fool us that way. It's hiding, right? And we have to first find it so that we can evaluate it. So let's look at when subject verb agreement does get tricky, right? So I'm going to imagine for a second that I have been replaced or could be replaced by the Blaise 3000 RoboTeacher. So we know we can use our ears. Blaise teaches, Blaise teach. We can hear that Blaise teaches wrong, right? So here we get into pronouns, right? The RoboTeacher is going to be it. So it teaches, it teach. Again, we can hear that it's going to be it teaches, right? Okay, so cool. So pronouns, if you think back to what is a pronoun is something that can take the place of a noun. So in this case, there was a very clear relationship, right? And, it, she, he, z, whatever pronoun, right? We could imagine. And again, you can learn these things. I'm not saying that you shouldn't go off and say, oh, right, that's because these are third person singular pronouns. Definitely valid. Very interesting. Not necessarily the starting point, not necessarily the place where you're going to feel like, do I need all those rules? Well, first you need this understanding. So let's again just run through this. Is this a complete sentence? It teaches. So let's look at our parts of speech. We've got it, the pronoun, so in the place of a noun. We've got a verb, teaches. So what roles do they play in the sentence? We've still got a subject. We've still got a verb, right? So yes, this is a complete sentence, right? So again, you can use your ears to get started with these simple test cases. Right? So the pronouns act as subjects. Pronouns also agree, right? It teaches. So it, one thing, singular. There's our singular verb, right? They teach. That was two things. It was plural, right? There's our plural verb. Okay. So where it gets tricky is when we have unusual pronouns. So we're used to thinking of pronouns as, oh yeah, like there could be I, you, we, they, again, it, she, he, other pronouns, right? Uh, but those are all what we call personal pronouns. And the personal pronouns are usually fairly closely tied. Like we can relate them pretty easily to things like Blaise or Blaise and friend Bruno or the Robo 3000 Blaise that replaced Blaise. Uh, but when we start to come up with ideas like this, here either is a pronoun, right? If we go down this list here, let's look in this. And this is the way you want to break it down. Either Blaise teaches or the robot teaches, right? So there in that formation, it's extremely clear, right? Blaise teaches, the robot teaches. With what we've seen before, it's very clear that those agree, right? Singular with singular in both cases. We can make it a little less clear. Either Blaise or the robot teaches, right? Now that just little stylistic efficiency of only saying the verb once makes it just that little bit less clear. Well, there's two things, but there's or, but which is that? But remember, what we're really doing is simply somewhat simplifying either Blaise teaches or the robot teaches. In each case, one person or thing, so singular, singular verb. And then what we often find then is where we get lost is when it becomes either teaches. And now all of a sudden, right, we've lost our grounding, right? Buried in there is all the stuff that was before, right? Either teaches is just a condensation of those other ideas. The way sometimes you reduce a fraction or reduce an equation, it's all in there. It's just been reduced, right? But sometimes when we start with, this kind of reduced form, that's when we start saying, what? Like either, what is that? Right? Sometimes you probably might even sort of struggle to sort of say, like, is either a pronoun or not, or what is it? What part of speech is that? So again, there's something you can say that you learned today. You learned that there are 8 parts of speech. You learned pronoun, right? It replaces noun. And again, started to get the idea that not all pronouns are created equally. Personal pronouns, relatively speaking, more familiar with us, but for us. But either, each, everyone, everybody, all, some of these are singular in ways that you wouldn't expect. Some of them are plural. Some of them can depend on the context, right? So that is the trick, right? To sort of say, oh, wait, so it actually never gets more complicated. It's always just singular, singular, plural, plural, but they trick me, or it gets trickier because they get into less familiar pronouns. I get into those situations like where I wasn't really sure if one was a prime number or not, and that was the key thing, right? So a question can come down to, oh, do I actually know those other pronouns? Do I know how either works, right? In this case, we can see either is singular, right? I can learn that, I can apply it, but when I apply it, I'm using the same ear that could hear singular, singular, plural, plural infallibly when we were looking at nouns and verbs. So the first trick is unusual pronouns. Let's look at another case, opposite sort of one. So here, right, we want to simplify. So if we were to start from the other end, both teach, I don't know, is that right or wrong? Now, again, you might have a sense of it, but what we're trying to make sure is we understand. We have that rock solid foundation. I don't know if any of you watch The Office. There's a scene there I always thought was funny where they're in their break room and they talk about a different sort of age-old grammar question where it's who or whom, and they have the classic grammar discussion where somebody offers an opinion, somebody offers the opposite opinion, they start arguing back and forth, people start offering different explanations, and instead of feeling like it clarifies things, they feel actually more confused. Which is it? Does anybody actually know? Maybe it depends, right? Well, it doesn't depend, because whether or not you look at both teach and you think you know it or you're pretty sure, well, here's how to be absolutely sure. Let's unpack it. And again, think about math. In the other one, we went from complex to simple, almost like you would when you're condensing or simplifying, reducing. Here, just like in math, where sometimes you factor things out or break things out, we can say, okay, here's how we know both teach is plural, right? Because both teach means both Blaise and the robot teach. In other words, they teach. And just the way our ear wouldn't let us down before, our ear wasn't saying Blaise and the robot teaches. It wasn't saying they teaches, right? So here we can be absolutely sure that both is plural, right? Both teach. The second thing that's always important to look out for, and again, if you're sitting there thinking, wow, this seems pretty basic, but this is it. I mean, this is what subject verb agreement comes down to on standardized tests. So if you can get this, right, you have to combine this with the ethic that says, when I'm there in that performance situation, I don't just sort of know this stuff, I know this stuff. And I don't not know where to begin some of the times. I always know to start by checking the subject and the verb. And I always know steps to take, right? To simplify, to expand, to try to get it down to that situation where I, distill it down to where it's a subject and a verb where I know my ear is reliable in terms of verifying if it's plural, plural, singular, singular, or if there's a mismatch. So the other trick that we always see is words getting in the way. So we talked earlier about how prepositions were going to be important. We see a bunch of them in here, right? In the laboratories, right? By multiple teams of, scientists and educators. And we've got other things in here. We've got other sorts of pronoun. We've got, there's another one here with. We've got, a fairly complicated sentence. Um, and that's actually getting in the way, right? We're actually not sort of seeing, like, if we try to break this down and we start sort of saying, like, well, what's really essential here? We actually find that none of this stuff is essential. That really what we need to do is clear all of those phrases and clauses out of there. And again, you don't necessarily need to know, at least not today, what a phrase is, what a clause is. What's the difference between a phrase and a clause? I heard somebody say prepositional clause. I heard somebody talking about, or a prepositional phrase. I heard somebody else talking about subjunctive clauses. What are all these things? Oh my goodness. I'm never going to learn all of this. Well, again, very interesting stuff. Just the way that there are branches of math and levels of math that are very interesting that not everybody needs to master, even to do very well on standardized tests, very well in high school, very well in some courses in university. What we need to learn to do now is to be able to say, don't get lost. It's still about the noun, the verb, right? The subject, the verb. The robot teaches. All the other stuff doesn't matter. What matters is getting your ear into the position where it can say robot teaches or robot teach, right? Is there a match or a mismatch, right? And that really is what it's all about, right? So those unusual pronouns and the words that are inserted in there to get in the way are really the two big things that trick you out of reliably, applying that sort of basic sense, that we sort of said off the top, like Karen said, isn't it just singular, singular, plural, plural? Absolutely it is. And this is why that sometimes doesn't play out in practice as easy as you might think, right? So how are we going to use subject verb agreement on the SAT and the ACT? Well, again, we just saw it there. Let's go back and say, think about what we said was difficult. Well, it was difficult when we didn't recognize the question. We weren't sure what they were asking. We weren't sure where to start and what steps to take, right? And we felt like we needed to know something specific at the last minute and we weren't quite sure. Like, maybe I did do all those things and I broke it down and at the end I'm still left with something like, each, and but then it was each, and then there was a bunch of plural stuff. So maybe if it's each and it's a group of I don't know. I think I'll just have to, again, spend too much time and try to tell myself a story. Again, stories are cool. Subjective English is cool. That stuff has its place, a wonderful, beautiful place, which is not, the world of mastering communication and the world of the kind of English skills and language skills that are really tested on tests like the SAT and the ACT, which have to be on some level objective, right? So, what are we going to do? We're going to automatically identify the subject and verb and check the agreement every time. It's a very difficult thing to accept, right? I mean, a lot of times, again, this is one of the things where what we're doing today is sort of really drilling down, slowing down, giving you something that even if you were doing an SAT or ACT prep course with the Princeton Review, we might not spend quite this much time, right? Some students will have seen this before. Some student will have to get through a certain amount of material, right? Which is all very valid and normal in educational experience. Today, we're doing something a little bit different where we really drill down. And again, as I said off the top, you're kind of getting a little bit of a two-in-one, because while we're looking specifically at subject verb agreement, we're also kind of looking at how that really can be one entry point to see the larger world of what makes you successful, right? We saw that getting started makes you successful, right? We saw that knowing when to trust your ear and when to apply a rule makes you successful, having that judgment, right? And now here what we're seeing is kind of an ethic, right? What's the difference between, a successful student or test taker and a less successful one? Oftentimes, it's the rigor with which they do this every time, right? A lot of times, when you're sort of, and you can develop the ability to self-evaluate. A lot of times a teacher or tutor can help you by sort of helping you to kind of be honest with yourself and saying like, okay, great, you improved, you did well, you missed a subject verb agreement question. I bet you can tell me that singular goes with singular and plural goes with plural, right? So why'd you miss this question? It's like, well, there could be lots of reasons. And at that moment, it might not seem particularly fair. Like, what am I supposed to be? Perfect. But obviously, we're always trying to do our best. And we're trying to get, often case, many of you are probably going for elite scores in line with elite goals of various kinds, right? And sometimes it just comes down to that ethic. You mean I actually have to check like every time? And you mean it's not just going to like sort of pop off the screen at me or jump out of the page at me? No, you're going to have to check every time. Right? Number two, you're going to expect to see those tricks. And just the way that you would expect to see, in the medium or difficult questions of a standardized test, you would tend to see more of those questions where they kind of try to disguise the information in the math problems, try to show you a circle and essentially you're trying to find the area of the circle, but they try to make it obscure or difficult, like where is the radius? I can't find the radius. They're going to do the same thing on grammar or on English questions. It's not subjective. It's not mysterious. It's not open to an opinion. They're going to give you wordy sentences that separate the subject and the verb that you have to look past. And you're going to have to know your unusual pronouns. It can help to understand them like we did, like how we sort of unpacked how either works and how both works, why either is singular, why both is plural. Those things can help you. That understanding can help make it stick in your memory better, right? But you're going to have to also know them, right? Um, so, so we just ignore prepositions. Good. Very good question, Karen. It's not so much that you ignore prepositions, right? It's that you sort of flag a preposition as something which is probably useful information if I was looking at the overall meaning of the sentence. But if I'm on a question which is asking me to evaluate, say, as you may know, many questions on the SAT or ACT ask you to evaluate the grammatical correctness of a portion of a sentence or to look at various sort of flagged portions of a sentence and identify whether there is an error or which one of the parts of the sentence has an error. Well, when you're doing that, oftentimes a preposition is a distractor. Now, you might have, like, ultimately, when you're sort of have a complete game plan, right? When you're totally ready to attack the practice test, right? Choose your favorite analogy, right? You're totally ready to do your piano performance or piano exam when you've both mastered your pieces and mastered your scales, or you're ready to play your sporting event when you can both dribble the ball and shoot the ball, right? So prepositions are distractors when I'm evaluating subject verb because they tend to introduce extra phrases, extra strings of words that distract me from evaluating the subject and the verb. Now, if it turns out that the subject and verb agree and there's not a problem there in the sentence, then I might loop back and say, next step, prepositions might become very important. Prepositions can be very key to the idioms, right? So there can be just arbitrary patterns of which prepositions we choose to use in certain situations. And that is another thing that gets tested. So again, hopefully here there's sort of an ethic of like, okay, cool. So I've got this sort of framework of understanding, testing, knowing my tools, and I can build out this list. I can master subject verb agreement. I can master each of these things. Remember, I said, who's this for? It's for people who want mastery, right? So this is one step on the way to mastery, but hopefully not just a step, but also a sort of a framework, right? And Karen also asked, when the sentence is about a wish, the verb is always plural, right? For instance, I wish I were in Canada is the subjunctive mood on the ACT and SAT and ACT. Good question. It can be. That's one of the things that is important to do for practice. So there can be structures like that that get tested. Now, I wouldn't say that that's something where, when you really prepare for the test, you kind of, rank things a little bit. So one of the reasons today why we're picking subject verb agreement as a concept to go into this kind of depth on is how foundational it is, how likely it is to come up, and how it can unlock sort of various situations. Something like the subjunctive is something that you're relatively speaking, less likely to see, that it could be considered, I mean, even in everyday language, it's a little bit less frequent of a concept, right? As we said, subject verb everywhere, agreement everywhere, subjunctive mood, not only somewhat unusual, but also more squarely under attack, right? While we can say, excuse me, well, we can say that there are places where people get creative and try to come up with means of expression and what we might call loosely sentences, which don't always have subject verb or subject verb agreement when they're pushing the boundaries in music or literature. Again, that's squarely in the creative and it's unusual, it's clear. Subjunctive mood is something that you hear done incorrectly in everyday speech like almost every day, right? I mean, almost everybody would say, I wish I was in Canada, right? You hear that all the time. Technically, it's incorrect, but it is used so often. And that's very interesting, right? That gets into the place where grammar is about experience and usage. And that's something that's very interesting to study, very interesting to study in the university level and classes where you go into syntax and semantics and everything. But that's something that would be relatively less likely to be, critical for this. Although every grammar rule can empower you, right? So know your unusual pronouns. Great question. So just in closing, we were together for about an hour. I just want to say at the end, like, you've got this, right? So each of you who attended the live stream offered by the Princeton Review today on YouTube is capable of mastering subject verb agreement, right? Each, surprisingly or not surprisingly, perhaps if you've already mastered that, is a one of those odd singular pronouns. In closing here, I will just put up on my screen here email address if you would like to email me and provide me with any feedback on today's session. Pardon me while I look down to type this up for you. I will send you a little chart of those pronouns as a little thank you. There, I think I okay. I think I have. Maybe Brian can tell me. Have I successfully put my email address up? Oh, there. I think I've got it now. So. Sorry about that. So if you want to email me there, I'd love to hear what you thought about the session today. Again, it's a little bit different than how we might approach this sometimes in our classes. Definitely went into some depth on it, and definitely tried to kind of back you away from the world of, I think this one is A, I think this one is C, I'm pretty sure this one is D, right? Because again, you have to find a time when you take a different perspective and you really self-evaluate and are honest with yourself, right? Or else you can always be stuck, right? You might be stuck at only 50-50, or stuck at 75 or out of 100. You might be stuck feeling a master of this concept and not a master of that concept. How are you going to break through? Right? It's by trying to focus on that kind of ethic, right? I'm going to learn where to start, right? I'm going to learn like what tools I already have that I can use, what new things I'm going to learn. I'm going to have an ethic of applying those things consistently. So, again, my name is Blaise. Thanks for joining the Princeton Review Live today. Our next session will be a week from today, Thursday, May the 28th at 1 p.m., when Aaron Lind, our high school content director, the person who oversees all the stuff on our SAT and ACT programs and others AP programs, will be doing something that will contrast dramatically today. So today we went extremely slowly and carefully. Next week, you're going to get a chance to see what somebody can do with that, how somebody can really fly when Aaron, Twitch style or YouTube style, is going to speed run a section of an SAT or ACT and show you how quickly it can be done, which starts from this kind of understanding and engagement. So again, thanks very much for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back here again. And do drop me an email, and I'll send you that pronoun chart. Take care.